being here. I know that I'm particularly pleased at your attendance and honored by speakers who have chosen to join us today to talk about an interesting subject, one that always either captivates people's attention or incites accusations of bad words. Use words like Sharia. It is often very difficult in a conversation not to only think that there are pejorative connotations, but that's only highlighted, I think, more recently by all the controversy about Kodak and the question about whether language is truly American. But as I said before, I'm truly honored to be joined here by the other speakers who I briefly introduced and whose biographies are before you today. Foremost, President Richard Bullitt at Columbia University. He has an extensive array of experience in the Middle East. His aptitude and the history, his understanding of Islam impressed me personally very deeply because it was really through a rather remote encounter with one of his lectures that was really available that really introduced me to Professor Bullitt's insight. And I hope that he will be sharing some of those insights with you today. In the audience is my wife, and I will always explain to her these kind of things. So I'm deeply honored to have him joining us today. In addition, next to the professor is His Excellency the Ambassador Ibrahim Rasool, who is here as the South African Ambassador to the United States, who has written extensively on the experience of Islam, and not only is his insights particularly important in the context of the intersection of Islam in the modern world, but he also serves as a member and representative of the state of South Africa, who has had to really discern the meaning of identity, and also importantly, within the context of a changing dynamic within sub-Saharan Africa, and is perhaps the newly emerging aspect of Islam that yet has to be contended with or dealt with in the next, probably the next 25 years. In addition, Professor John Esposito will be joining us here shortly. He is coming directly from National Airport, and perhaps needs no introduction. He is the head of the Center for Christian Muslim Understanding in Georgetown. He has written dozens of books on Islam, and he most coyly noted to me that he is writing his next book on Islamic law, so I beat him to the punch. But he is a world-renowned figure, and it was perhaps Professor Esposito that first inspired me to look at the question of Islam as a young man growing up in Wyoming. And then finally, Dali Moghead, who is going to be joining us here shortly, is herself an expert unto herself. She was recently named as one of the most influential Muslim women in the world. Her scholarship is far and wide. Not only is her aptitude of the historical Islam, but also of present Islam, in particular from the vantage point of both women that are living as a member of various Muslim communities, and she and Professor Esposito joined in their important work, Who Speaks for Islam? What a Billion Muslims Really Think. And she and I have been in many panels together, most notably about the recent events in Egypt, and it was a real pleasure to have her joining us here shortly. For the moderating session, we will have one of our own, Dan Brumberg, who is our USIP Special Advisor on Iran and North Africa. He is previously a Randolph Fellow, has taught at the University of Chicago, and is sort of spearheading our efforts on the discussion about Iran here within USIP. So hopefully we will, while we may be long, we will hopefully be somewhat entertaining. To the guide. This really came to me as a prompting, at the urging, really, by the State Department about the question and the necessity to give people and to give practitioners in the Arab rule of law context about Islam and Islamic law. And whereas a previous scholar had tried to attempt it, and I was given an initial draft, I immediately was struck by how difficult the subject was, and most notably how difficult the subject is when you're playing 14 centuries of thinking. And when you're trying to give language to really the language of a civilization that is expanded beyond borders and beyond language. Now, the question about the relevance of Islamic law has always struck many people. Is it relevant? Is a religious form of law still relevant in the context of modernity? And this is always a debate that I think scholars talk about, that many colonial powers had discussed, but I think the answer is a resounding one, which is that Islamic law is not only relevant because it forms the part and parcel of personal practice, it gives outlines to one's norms, it also charts a course for what many states are struggling with about their political future. What does it mean to be an Islamic republic? What does it mean to have Islamic identity? And perhaps most importantly, who speaks for what this law means? Now, I always challenge my students, because I teach a course on Islamic law at George Washington, and I'm always asking, what is the law? And what's interesting about that is that most of my law students don't really have a good answer about that. It sort of is a little bit of a problem in law schools. But the question remains, how do you transform a legal ethos, a divinely revealed text, the characterization of a single man, and expand that to a civilization? How do you then unify that civilization under this larger, broader ethos, and yet remain unified over time? And so there have been many struggles when you talk about Islam, when you talk about Islamic law, to then conceptualize that challenge to a practitioner's guide, and then begins the problem. So when the State Department asked me to take a stab at it, it was not only to identify the various sources that you could talk about, the Quran and the Sunnah, and to talk about not only the various doctrines that jurists have come up with, which are very important. The real transformative effect has been, how do states view the subject? Because now we live in an era where nation states determine authority. And because nation states are the determining force and authority, the question then arises, are they in the best position to be the authority? Because the history of Islamic law has been one that has been epistemologically driven, where knowledge and being the font of knowledge was more important than one's ethnic background, one's social standing. And that if one could access education, if one could access a particular understanding of the doctrines and the texts, then you would have clarity, you would have insight. And that would be enough. That's a far removed concept than where we are today. Today we have non-state actors who claim to speak for the religion. We have those who are not classically trained, who claim to give a decree about what religion means. And then, of course, we have the political considerations. The political considerations of states who say this is what Islam is, or this really is what is Islam for us. That becomes a real challenge because you have to then compete for the state's singular authority and scholars who are saying, well, there is no unified idea, because frankly, the answer that most Islamic scholars have always given is, God knows best. So it's interesting to note that we live not only in an interesting time where the ascendancy of Islamic law is remarkable, and debates still rage in places like Egypt, and most recently in Tunisia, who's just introduced their constitution. And the questions about Islam's fortitude is at the heart of the issue in places like Afghanistan, in places like Iraq. Most recently, when I was challenged with the convergence of state power and religious identity, I was invited to partake in a discussion in Afghanistan on how do you incorporate Islamic criminal law in a modern context. How do you deal with the question about the rights that women have with respect to their authority and their legitimacy versus the zeal to sort of say this is the law. And these are important debates, and they are debates that are raging and debates that are not only intriguing, but they also shape the fate of nations. Take a look at Syria. Take a look at what's going on in many places throughout the Muslim world, and it's not hard to see. Then there's also demographics. Why would a guide like this be relevant? Someone said, well, the footnote of this guide is that it really is for Afghanistan. But take a broader look at the Muslim world today. Take a broader look at how many Muslims there are. Present trends are correct. By 2020, half the world's population will identify Islam as their religion. And if the key ingredient of that identity, religious identity, is an adherence to law and is adherence to norms, then at the very least, practitioners, those who work in post-conflict states, and those who frankly are intrigued by the world around them would probably do well to take a look at the subject. Now, having said that, I admit that in 100 pages, it's very hard to surmise all of this tradition. And I'm always left with the humility that others, not only here, but all around the world, and historically speaking, were provided, that it is only a glimmer of an understanding about Islamic law. And that in many ways, I probably have shortchanged doctrines, excluded others, and there are other important ways in which Islamic law can be fleshed out. But it is also an evolving subject. Recently, I was asked by Stanford University to talk about the role that Islamic law plays in the issue of property. And there, the discussion is about, well, does Islam have a discourse about nuisance? Right? The modern concept that if you build buildings too closely and block someone's sunlight, is that right? But then, there are other important issues. Ones that, for example, coincide with marriage. If a woman is denied her property rights and inherited rights delineated in the Quran, what does that say about the society? What does it say when there is a denial of property rights at marriage, or when those property rights aren't being held? So you see the vast array of differences. And then you talk about contemporary states, many of which have said that, in fact, we might not need a law. That we don't need Islamic law to answer the perennially important questions. And that recently, while many Muslims have been asked repeatedly about the centrality of Sharia, the concept of this divine law, they have said that it still needs to be reformed. And that perhaps the best incarnation of Islamic law is not in the strict adherence to the letter of the law, but rather to the spirit of the law, to the ethics that it has outlined, an ethics that is looked upon when we speak of areas of like corruption, when we talk about areas of just and fair play, when we try to talk about issues about the accused. So whether you're talking about the letter, whether you're talking about the spirit, it is still a relevant discourse, and one that is still to be had in many parts of the world, and is frankly central to people's lives. Now, finally, there is also the other aspect about Islamic law that is perhaps more central to what rule of law practitioners and what conflict is seen here at the Institute of Peace, about deciding who is a believer. Who is a believer? This is a perennial debate within Islamic civilization and Islamic history. Questions were posed to the Prophet, and Islam's first civil war was divided along questions about who, for example, constitutes a proper believer. Today, that question is still being posed in places like Nigeria, which I had the honor of visiting a few weeks ago, in which there is a growing insurgency by Boko Haram, who basically makes the claim that in order to have proper to believe, you have to institute Islamic law. A claim similarly made by people, by those in the Taliban, by others more militant and more willing to say that in order to establish the rule of law, to establish an adherence to an incorruptible source of law, we need Islamic law. So it is both an end unto itself, a historical end, a civilizational end, and it is also a want on the part of many, whether it's as state actors or by non-state actors. So this guide provides at least some insight. And perhaps the most important part about this guide is that it has a glossary. Because we as lawyers love to define ourselves with the ability to decipher language, and Islamic jurists are no different. They love to fester in language, so if you take anything away from the guide, know that there is a fairly robust attempt at a glossary that gives you insight into hopefully the context of everything else. Finally, I'd like to not only thank the State Department, INL, for their vigorous support and repeated encouragement, but I'd also like to thank my family, who bore with me and whose son's repeated suggestions of, Dad, when is this going to get done? And I always have to remind him, my son, it is never done. But anyway, thank you for that.